Welcome to the AI+HI project. I'm Nichol Bradford, SHRM's executive in residence for AI+HI. Each week, we sit down with visionaries from the worlds of business, tech, and HR to provide you with deep insights, actionable strategies, and practical advice for harnessing the transformative potential of artificial intelligence and human ingenuity. This week, we're exploring the intersection of AI, economic opportunity, and workspace transformation. Our guests today are Xavier de Souza Briggs, Senior Fellow at the Brookings Institute and former professor at MIT, whose work spans academia, philanthropy, and public service. And we're also fortunate enough to have Molly Kinder, Fellow at the Brookings Institute, and she is a Senior Advisor on New America's Work, Workers, and Technology Initiative. She's a professor of practice at Georgetown University and many other extraordinary things. Together, their insights on creating inclusive economies in the age of AI have been particularly influential. So welcome to the AI+HI project.
Thanks for having us.
Both of you have had really compelling backgrounds. And so we like to start out letting our audience really understand a little bit about our guest. For each of you, could you describe really what inspired you to focus on tech disruption and economic inequality and the future of work from your two perspectives, starting with Molly?
You know, my passion for many years has been on work and workers and how do we make sure jobs for workers are good and workers really can flourish in this economy. Technology has really captured my imagination. It's an issue I've worked on since starting about 7 years ago. But ChatGPT's release, I think like a lot of people, really doubled down. I double clicked on technology and work because it just is something that's moving so fast and is so disruptive.
And Nicole, I mean, for me, this is very personal. I was raised by a single working mom, and it felt like the coming of the computer revolution, it affected her. She was part of a generation that wasn't native to it. It did grow up with all these machines that were a part of my life as we grew up. And I worked on the quality of work and also the dignity of work and workers' voices for a very long time in the different settings that you mentioned, in government, academia, in philanthropy, supporting advocacy, and now here at Brookings.
Great. And also, my father was a plumber, and I've been working in technology for 20 years now. And I, too, as soon as I really understood what was happening, I focused on ChatGPT and AI and this intersection of humanity at work. So one of the concepts that I found that you introduced is this concept of the great mismatch between AI vulnerable jobs and worker representation. Could you define this concept for our audience and also the challenges with it?
Sure, I'm happy to. So when we, just to sort of paint the picture, at Brookings, we were fortunate enough to get access through OpenAI to some data that shows every task, every occupation across the economy, and what is the exposure to ChatGPT for technology. So to what extent could those tasks and those occupations, could you save half the time using this technology? So it really paints a picture of which types of jobs and which types of sectors do we imagine to see the most transformation and disruption. And what we did is we contrasted those sectors. We looked at the level at which workers in those types of jobs are represented by a union. And what we found is we're calling the great mismatch, where we expect to see the jobs most change, most disrupted, and potentially where we might see the greatest job losses happen to be in the areas where there's the lowest union representation across the entire economy. So overall, we see about 10% of workers in a union, but in these sectors, it could be as low as 1%, 4%. And we wanted to highlight that because one of our views about the ways that this technology can be introduced in the workplace in ways that are going to be beneficial to workers is making sure workers had some agency, some voice, some power to shape how that will play out. And unions are one very compelling example of how that's possible. We don't have as good metrics to measure sort of worker representation out of unions, but when we looked at some of those sectors, and industries, those were ones where we really don't even see a lot of intermediary organizations that even have a forum for workers to come together and discuss these issues. So it's something we're deeply concerned about.
Absolutely. Especially since so many of the roles that are going to be affected, as you said, are white collar workers in many ways who haven't had a union, haven't had a need for a union, don't really have a history of having a union. So when you look ahead and you look at the relationship between worker empowerment and this AI integration evolving, how do you see the task being affected?
On one hand, Nicole, there's one key exception to this great mismatch we were just naming. And remember, Marlon talked about it across the economy. We looked at over 1,000 occupations. The public sector is an important exception. Not to say this is going to be easy in any sector, but the unionization rate is about 5 times what it is in the private sector. So we should bear that in mind. About 1 in 7 workers in the American economy works for government, mostly state and local. That includes teachers and lots of healthcare workers, but also people in the machinery of government, right, who deliver services for us each and every day, and they're firemen and they're police officers and many other things. So that's different about the public sector. But in terms of how this is likely to play out, I mean, I think one of the things we want to underscore is whether or not you're a part of a union, whether or not you're an employer that's used to dealing with unions, informal collective bargaining, and that sort of thing. There's a whole spectrum of options available to employers. Some of them are called workers' councils. In manufacturing, sometimes they've been called quality circles because they focus on tapping the wisdom of workers to improve the process of production or of delivering a service. We actually do have some muscle memory, but we have to be intentional about this. And we have to get started right away. I think that's one of our top messages. There's no time to lose. Engaging your workers so they don't sit there just wondering, well, what's the shoe that's going to drop that management's not telling me about? Or how do I, on my own, on some combination of YouTube and LinkedIn, kind of train myself on this stuff because no one is helping. We can do better than that.
Yes. One of the things that we've been looking at in our research at SHRM is, of course, we've been looking at trust inside the organizations, because what we're really searching for also is what are the determinants of success and failure in a successful human-centered AI implementation. And so trust is a very big factor. And we're sort of seeing it as it certainly is a technological change, but it also is a social, cultural, behavioral shift. And to make that shift successfully requires a great deal of trust. And I think the trust is also tied to organizations supporting the agency that you're talking about. And so one of the things that keeps me up at night is we read a lot about the estimated number of new jobs that people say are going to be created by AI. And sort of very practically speaking, how do we get to those? How do we train the workers that we have today to be able to make that transition so they don't, as you said, have to figure it out on LinkedIn or YouTube themselves? I'd love to hear how you're thinking about it, because I agree with you. It's like we have to get started on this right away. How do you think about that transition and upskilling and reskilling?
Well, I think first we just want to address that really good point you made about trust. And I think part of the reason why trust is such an important factor with generative AI specifically is I think your audience and sort of everyone in the workplace has a gut instinct that this is a technology that could be a tool that makes their jobs better, makes them more efficient, makes them smarter, makes them enjoy their job more. Maybe they'll earn more money because of it. Or it has the potential to be a tool that devalues their skills or substitutes for them and is just really about cost cutting. And I think that the trust comes when workers feel that the motivation and the spirit behind this technology is one that really empowers them. It's about being a tool that augments and is not something that management has sort of a grand vision of just cutting costs. And so I think that I think the reason why we see a lot of issues with trust is I think people have a sense this technology is a tool, but how it's used for what motivation in what way is really materially going to impact them. And do they trust the motivations? Do they trust that what is the purpose of the exercise? And so I think this gets back to what Zav was talking about is, workers are assets. They know they see the job better than anyone because they're in it. And I think when sort of the sort of messaging and the mentality is one of, you're valuable, you understand this work, and we want to find a way to make you better in your job. I think that can create the trust that allows workers to feel, okay, I'm going to embrace, I'm not going to sort of be scared of this technology. I'm going to really run toward it. I'm going to embrace it. But I think that's sort of part of what is sort of necessary in the trust equation. And I think, everyone's at a different point of using generative AI. I think we're seeing in the data that even in the same occupation, we're seeing very different rates of uptake. Some people are super users, they're paying the $20 a month for ChatGPT, and other colleagues they are not even touching it. And so what is going to motivate people to sort of get over that hump and experiment with it? And do they have the sort of blessing of management? Is there a culture that says this should be bottom up? Please go experiment, find ways to use this and make it something that's good for you. Or do they feel like this is something, if they actually experiment with it, it's going to somehow harm them, that they might be, training their replacement. So I think a lot of this encouragement of how people can experiment and lean into it, I think is going to come from the signaling and the messaging from management.
Yeah, one of the companies that I spoke to a few weeks ago, it's a multinational, and in their internal transformation, their population fell into 4 groups of roughly 25%, and they do a lot of manufacturing. And so 25% were the super users, 25% were the, never touchers, and 25% would follow the super users. So that sort of speaks to the champions and communities of practice. And then there was a 25% that would use it, but they didn't want to train it because if there were problems with it, they didn't want to be blamed for it. So, to your point, the message to get people to run towards it a bit is really about how it can enhance rather than replace human capabilities. And so when you look at that enhancement, how does the Brookings Institute think about that?
On one hand, we are encouraging and exploring with others really concrete demonstrations, Nichol. So this is AI in use with the kinds of messages that Molly was underscoring that are about being more effective, making work better, making an organization more effective, whether it be a healthcare provider, a commercial bank, a public school district, some other kind of organization, a university potentially. And the question is, can you move beyond sort of the offer on paper with the marketing about AI says, which offers some starting points, offers suggestions as to what use could look like, and begin to really actively experiment with improving the things that you do and engaging workers as you do that. One thing I would underscore here, just for us to keep in mind, I mentioned, earlier in our history, we've sort of seen parts of this movie, whether it be in manufacturing and engaging workers and improving quality, because there are things that they uniquely know from the front lines that managers don't know, not until they talk to workers. It's also the case that most of us in the white collar professions, let's be honest, we've all lived through bad software rollouts. We've all seen things that were, more effective and more transparent, and full of learning and full of support and encouragement and kind of well-paced. And then we've seen the other version where things just get kind of announced and they're different from one day to the next. And maybe we didn't receive any training, but the expectations are different. And then you're swapping, notes with colleagues on the workarounds that you need now for the new software that doesn't do what it's supposed to. Millions of people have lived that and lived it a number of times. So, this is also something to draw on if you're an employer or you're a mid-manager and you're kind of given the green light by the boss or by the board or what have you to experiment, to develop the use examples in a really concrete way, is to draw on those things, those common experiences that people have, and center the conversation on being more effective, on quality and what's going to drive that, what's going to deliver that. It's hard to answer your question in general because we looked at all these different occupations. There's everyone in there, from plumbers to architects to coders to doctors, financial analysts, insurance claims processors, so many more. It's going to look a bit different, of course, enterprise to enterprise and occupation to occupation. But these are some of the principles. And there's some starting point frameworks, at least, out there. We cite it in our research. We talk about it. They're a bit high level for now. We need to drill, we didn't need to bring this down to the level of workers and managers actively problem solving. And that's really only just beginning.
Zav, could you describe a couple of those principles or frameworks for our audience?
Sure. Well, one of them, I'll name a few names as well. So the Partnership on AI put out a shared prosperity framework last year. The Department of Labor, to its credit, drawing on that, but also other sources, drawing on our research and that by economists and many others, likewise put out some guidelines earlier this fall. So these are publicly available. They're on the web. They begin with, in effect, sort of structured checklists. If you're an employer, questions to ask yourself, ways to relate the products and services you deliver and the workforce you have to the promise of AI, really as a way to sort of orient yourself, to come up with a game plan and to think about the various steps along the way at which you can do that with your workers. Quick example, Nichol, there's a lot of conversation, tends to be a tendency to think about, let's call it the last mile, like contact with customers, the back end of deployment, as opposed to coming up with the use examples, the why behind using AI at all. And workers have a lot to share on that. People who have been working in an industry and they have wisdom from their contact, whether it's patients in a hospital, kids in a school, or literally, again, all these other settings, supporting professionals in an accounting firm or design build, for or somewhere else, have wisdom about problems worth solving. And this, too, is a piece of the movie that, in a sense, we've seen before. If you think about a lot of the bad computer deployment of the 80s and 90s, the kind of early days of mass computing, a lot of it was just sort of taking a business process as it was and slapping technology on it. It became clear over years and years, and here's the real clincher, millions of dollars badly spent, that the much better way to go was to think about what the technology would enable you to solve that was important. And then redesign your process and think about how workers fit into it. And, machines are a part of it too, and who needs what training. It's a different way of coming at it, if that makes sense.
Yeah. And one of the things that we've seen in looking at on the failure side of AI implementations. And so a few weeks ago, the RAND put out a study on AI failures. And one, they fail at twice the rate of IT projects because it's not an IT project. And two, that 80% failure rate that we saw with machine learning and predictive is also carrying over into generative AI, even though everyone's still just getting started. I think what's so interesting about this is that, to your point, no one really knows yet, because everyone's just getting started and really experimenting around it. And so, what we're exploring also is like, what are the cultures that are AI compatible,
Right.
so that you can have a successful implementation. And so I'm wondering what you've seen around how organizations might be able to build cultures that successfully balance this tech advancement with worker dignity and representation.
I think that's a really good question. And it's something that we have been grappling with is what does good look like? What is it that we want to see? An employer is excited about this technology, wants to figure out ways to use this. What is it that we actually want to see happen? And what does good look like? I think we have in conversations about sort of business practice and corporate practice, we have sort of a sense of what does it mean to be a good employer when it comes to paying your workers or caring about your environmental impact or diversity and inclusion. I don't think we have a really clear sense yet of what does really good look like in terms of implementing generative AI vis-a-vis your workers. But I think this notion of sort of a culture and of values, I think what some of the examples that has been pointing to is what does it look like to meaningfully engage your workers as you're deciding the use cases of this and how it's going to be applied? Is this something that's very top down? Is this something that workers are going to be able to actively shape? Um, what does it mean to make sure that that across your workforce, everyone really is able to be accessing it? So we're seeing in the data some really stark gender divides in even within the same occupations, for instance. Women are much less likely. There was a Danish study, because just it happened to be that the data in Denmark was so good, they have the most definitive study, and they picked, I think, something like eight, eight occupations: a teacher, a programmer, very ubiquitous jobs, and they found the biggest divide in terms of being a super user, paying for the ChatGPT plus subscription, really engaging with the technology. Gender was the number one. It was not age, it was not education, it was gender. And so I think that just tells you that there's some cultural. My personal view on some of this is sometimes people think they're not supposed to use this technology. It's not always. A lot of people are experimenting quietly behind the scenes, and I think there might be a slight gender difference in who sort of is the risk takers, who's sort of breaking the norms. And sometimes women can be a little rule abiding. I think this is the same reason why we're seeing women in college campuses using ChatGPT less in some of their academic assignments. So I think some of this is sort of, how do we make sure people feel that they have a say in this? They have a voice in the direction. How are they being empowered to experiment and find ways in their own job to make their job better? I do it all the time. I pay out of pocket for my AI subscriptions. This isn't something my workplace told me to do. I just know there's value there, and I want to be the best researcher on AI and have the biggest impact I can. So I use AI tools. I use Perplexity AI. I use ChatGPT. I'm always experimenting and trying to figure out how to use these tools. But that doesn't always come from the workplace. I haven't really been told to do that. And so I think you end up having situations where you have very uneven access and usage in ways that is leaving a lot of value on the table. So I think some of this comes down to culture in terms of trusting workers, empowering them, putting them in the driver's seat, being really careful to make sure you're not accidentally creating inequities in who's actually benefiting from the technology. And I think the common thread here is it really has to be worker driven and bottom up.
Briefly, a couple things here, Nichol, that might be useful for your audience. First of all, as researchers in this space are encouraging us to recognize more and more, AI is beginning to deploy as a part of larger technology systems. For example, enterprise software, where AI tools are being added, right? As opposed to AI somehow in isolation. That's another reminder of the importance of what Molly is saying, this broader issue, to your question, of the culture of work more broadly, not just AI as kind of an isolated problem to be solved or opportunity to be leveraged. And on that, to broader context, use of technology, the role of human labor, of decision-making, et cetera. One thing I would refer your audience to is the good jobs principles were developed over the last couple of years by a combination of researchers, employers, worker advocates, others. We never really had them as a country before. We used the term good jobs a lot in job quality. And for your audience, obviously, this is near and dear. This is daily bread. But we didn't have consistent meanings, really. And the effort, people came together across sectors to put together these principles and then created something called the Good Jobs Champions, which hundreds of employers have signed up for. It's not a policy proposal. It's not a legislative campaign, anything like that. It just says, I recognize the value of these principles. It talks about dignity, it talks about the nature of the workplace, pay and benefits as well, of course, the material rewards of work. But it offers that kind of broader framework for then embedding productive, responsible, ethical use of AI as you engage workers that we think is valuable.
Molly, something that you mentioned earlier about the gender differences with AI usage. I was looking at the code.org study on STEM and what they ultimately discovered, and that they published this earlier this year, that the number one thing that makes the difference more than any programs or anything like that is just making STEM or just making computer science a requirement for high school and college. And that one thing changes gender, changes race inside of the number of people who are choosing to explore these categories. And so I wonder, to your point about people at work not choosing it. And I'm mindful of how Ethan Mollick at Wharton immediately after ChatGPT exploded made a requirement to use it, not an option, but a requirement to be in any of his classes. I am sort of reminded, or I'm thinking about, like, maybe that's what it takes. Like, organizations just have to say, you must use this, for the ones who are really serious about getting their employees to at least explore it. Because the other thing I'll say is that, people have to get to what we've seen in talking to lots of organizations is people have to get to a threshold of experimentation to be even to be able to understand what it can do, and also, more importantly, what it can't do. Because what makes these co-pilots sing is that deep expertise. And so there's a couple of organizations that we've talked to that after their employees really started playing with it, what they noticed that surprised them was an increase in confidence in the employees about their own expertise, because they realized, oh, without me, this thing will start talking nonsense pretty quickly without me, without my expertise to really guide it and prompt it properly. So I don't know, does the good jobs include also requiring AI use? What do you think about that?
I would say it's promising. It's important for a bunch of reasons. Just to give the Ethan Mollick story, is like it sort of shift the default, shift the expectation. Mollick did that very quickly. Molly and I talked to a lot of audiences about this. Recently, I was talking to folks who make labor policy and help to control, workforce investments, including taxpayer funds and how to use community colleges, many other kinds of important settings. And in spite of all this, focus that we had placed on the future of work and the nature of work and the risks and so on, first question I got was about plagiarism. I mean, it really came from a place of, but, the trainees are not going to get these critical thinking skills. They're going to use AI as a crutch in the wrong way. I understand the concern, of course. And I'm a former educator. I totally understand the concern. But I think we have to quickly change the default on this. Get many more people, to Molly's point, in use and using. And it's, we should know that technology companies understand the business value to them, too, of familiarizing lots of people quickly. The people who are more trained up become champions inside of organizations who are adopting these processes. So it's their business interests and their philanthropic, commitments so far are quite aligned, but they can't be the only ones offering that message. I think we need to take the initiative.
Yeah, and I just want to plus one. I mean, I'm a huge fan of Ethan Mollick's work, and I was really compelled in his book, Co-Intelligence, how he talks about you have to pass, I can't remember how many hours, it's 10 hours, or there's some threshold that after you've used these technologies enough, the light bulb goes off and you're fluid enough to understand how to use it in your own capacity. I would consider myself a super user, so I come up with so many creative ideas in my personal and my professional life. But most of the people I talk to have no idea about any of those. So, I think there's a question of it, carrot or a stick. I think Ethan's point is you motivate, you create competitions internally, you encourage those super users. There's a lot of people hiding that they're using it, put it out in the open and give rewards for the best ideas. I'm not clear that necessarily is going to address some of the equity that you have leaders and laggards, and there might be really important demographic and socioeconomic characteristics of those. And so I think maybe it's sort of like really being attuned to your workforce and ask why people are or not engaging with the technology and finding ways to overcome some of the hesitation. But, I think, I think the idea of requiring 10 hours of use to get over that hump is probably a good idea.
And so out of all the research that you've done this year, what has surprised you the most? What finding really surprised you about how people are approaching AI, or really anything that you've learned?
I mean, findings about, for example, doctors diagnosing conditions, doctors with AI on its own. They are really stunning. The quality of diagnosis, for example, that AI is attaining already. And it's a positive, we think, that you have a growing number of doctors, small number for now, arguably, but doctors themselves saying, this is a thing. This is a remarkable technology. Let's get on the question of how we can use this to improve patient care, even improve, work life of doctors. But let's not pretend there's this just vast category of tasks that technology will never be able to perform. We're so invaluable. Just to dramatize it a little bit, this will never come and touch these things. That's just not true. So that research is quite stunning, and I think it's going to get more and more attention.
Yeah, I would say, I mean, Nichol, we were talking a little bit about this, I think, before we started this conversation. I think there's a lot of sacred cows. There's been a sense of, this is what technology is, and this is the kind of work that's at risk. And for decades, we've associated automation and technology with like male blue collar work. That's really our conviction. And our headline for our report for Brookings was, this is not your grandmother or grandfather's automation. This is a very different technology. It's impacting a very different segment of the workforce, much more high skilled. The predominant education group is people with a bachelor's degree. This is not necessarily for job loss. It's just where we're going to see the disruptions. Gender, women are more exposed. They're more at risk of automation than men. That is not what the prevailing sense in society is. And I think there's been some, I've worked in this space of technology and work. I started 7 years ago, but well before ChatGPT came out. And we had a lot of assumptions, what is human? Of course, technology is going to get better at doing the routine, the not very human stuff. So humans should be less like a machine and more human. That was the way to stay ahead of the technology. Get more education, be more creative, be more empathetic, be more interpersonal, be more strategic and persuasive. There were all these adjectives that we associated with humans are best at. The technology is going to do these kind of machine-like things. We've got to do everything else. And I think humans still have an edge with today's version of technology on many of those fronts, but that is shrinking. And what surprised me the most is this technology is calling into question the uniqueness of the human attributes that we have always ascribed. And I think I did a big case study on the Hollywood writers because I think it was a surprise that the first visible resistance to this technology was not blue collar work. This was not, manufacturing workers or truck drivers. It was highly creative, highly educated, white collar writers. And so this has upended, I think, a lot of our assumptions of what's vulnerable, what's technology good at, what is uniquely human. And I think that bar moves so fast as each new iteration comes out. The bar is moving so fast that I think it's a challenge to keep.
Yeah. When the strike was going on and I would chat with a couple of business people and we would talk about it, they felt that it was sort of those creators over there. And I was like, no, you don't understand. Prompting makes you a creator. Like that strike is about you. It's just the very first piece of it because these technologies actually make us creators. All of us are creators. Every time you prompt, you're creating, you're co-creating. So, and I just want to double click on something about the, where is the path? Because if being, as human as you can be is potentially insufficient, is it then really the level to which you are capable of co-creating with these technologies? Is that what people should be focused on when they're thinking about their future of work?
I mean, I certainly think in a lot of ways, these technologies are a tool that we have to use to maximize our potential. So I think there is some of that. I also think there is a residual of really, what is the technology not good at and where can we add? It's still bad at judgment. It still is not able to form real relationships. We're not comfortable with this technology making high stakes decision making. I mean, even if there was an AI that could cut my hair, I'd still want to go to my hairdresser. I mean, there's some things that are like I asked you, I did 30 hours of talking to ChatGPT in advanced voice mode, role playing jobs to figure out where is this new frontier. I asked it to give last rites as if, Catholic last rite. They wouldn't do it. Even if it did, we wouldn't accept ChatGPT's version of a Catholic priest. I mean, my devout relatives would not accept that. There's a lot of things it could mimic that we still don't think we don't want them as a society. And I think it's up to us to figure out what that is. We really have to grapple hard, really, what is uniquely human? And as these capabilities extend, what are the things that we add value to it with? And what are things that it can never do? And I think it's a really important question because there's a lot of young people trying to decide what to study. People are making plans for their future. And these are really existential questions I think need to be addressed. Some of it is going to be the human machine interaction, and some of it's going to be what are things that just the technology can never do that we need to be, that really is our edge.
I think there's AI as a tool, Nicole, and its sense of history and context is getting better, and the tools are offering more in the way of caveats and naming their sources, which we think is a step. Needs to go farther in terms of the quality control, the reliability of the information, trustworthiness, etc. It's pretty clear, though, with some of these more advanced models that combine voice and it combine visuals and more over time, that AI will be deployed for kind of first contact or first intake or first coach or advisor on certain things, raising all kinds of questions about human beings as and more workers as, in effect, managers of the tool that interacts with the human customer. You think it's probably going to be choppy for a while, but that could be empowering and a route to developing higher order skills. Those results aren't guaranteed in any way, shape, or form. That's not the only way this could play out.
And this doesn't even bring into the conversation agents and having digital colleagues and what is all that going to mean. I mean, I think there's so many unknowns ahead.
Yeah. So a final question for our audience. I'm a HR leader, and what should I do the Monday after I listen to this podcast? What should I do? What is the first thing I should do to get ready for this future of work? What's your advice for me?
I would probably put it in two buckets. One is to empower myself about what this technology is and how it's going to impact my workforce. You can ask ChatGPT. It literally, the technology itself can help guide you. Just ask big questions. If you're not familiar with it, I think being somebody who really deeply thinks about where this is going and how it could impact your workforce. And the second thing is get in touch with your workers. Make sure you are empowering them, giving them opportunities for voice. Look at your structures. Is there a forum by which your employees have a voice? I had a meeting today with colleagues in our finance team. It was the first time we've had a whole finance team discussion about AI. It's just because I'm interested as a researcher, but that's not happening. Teams are not sitting down and having an open conversation about AI. I'm asking, how do you feel about it? Where is this most exciting to you? What are you concerned about? Are you using it? I don't think HR leaders are necessarily empowered to have those conversations, but that's how I would start. Meet your team where they are, get really smart about this technology, and look for opportunities for your employees to have a seat at the table.
Completely agree. Plus one, plus 1,000 to where Molly started. Start by getting more familiar yourself. If you're not already an active user, it takes less effort than you think, but start. Begin to use it. Use the AI itself as a partial guide. But then, as a sort of roadmap to these next pieces that you were talking about, Molly, I'd say go and grab off the Department of Labor those guidelines for employers. Take a look at them. It's a structured framework framed broadly for our job economy, for the wide range of things that get done in the economy, all kinds of different occupations. It's a starting point. It's not tailored, but then that's the whole point. And the AI is not going to give you that. For now, it'll give you some canned answer about, a general notion of being a tool or an aid to workers or ethical principles. Fine and good, but real human beings who have thought hard about the technology, including people who are developing the leading edge, worked together to put those guidelines together. So use them as a starting point.
Great. Thank you so much. And that's it for this episode. A big thank you to Xavier and Molly for sharing your experiences and insights with us. Before we wrap up, I encourage you to follow the AI+HI project wherever you enjoy your podcast. If you enjoyed today's episode, please take a moment to comment, leave a review, and help spread the word. It makes a difference. And finally, you can find all of our episodes on our website at shrm.org/AIHI. Thanks for joining the conversation, and we'll catch you next time.
SHRM.